Hey, welcome everyone to a very special sort of midweek live at the Nutmeg Tavern. And we've got a real special one because of this time of year. We thought, and especially because of Monday's video, that we would actually do a reading of Sleepy Hollow because it's such a great story, and it's actually important to read this sort of thing to understand the 18th century better. This was written in 1820, and the author was alive in the 18th century, and the people he was writing to, they were alive in the 18th century. They knew what it was like. So they knew that what the story he was telling had a real sort of atmosphere. So let's sit back and enjoy this Legend of Sleepy Hollow written by Washington Irving. This is abridged. I'm not going to read the entire thing, every word of it, because I don't know if I have that much voice. But this is a nice abridgment, and it's got such wonderful language. Let's dig in. Here we go. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. In the bosom of one of the most spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, there lies a small market town or rural port, which by some is called Greensburg, but which is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days by good housewives of the adjacent country, from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley or lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks upon the uniform tranquility. There is a little valley or lap of land, from the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called Sleepy Hollow boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrick Hudson. Certain it is the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual revelry. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the nightmare, with their whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of our gambles. The dominant spirit is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who was ever and anon seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of the night, as if on wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts allege that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows, and the spectre is known at all the country firesides by the name of the headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. In this byplace of nature there abode a worthy character of the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or, as he expressed it, tarried, in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders and long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by and a formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices, conning over their lessons, might be heard in a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive. When school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would convoy some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters or good housewives for mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small, and would have scarcely been sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, though lank. He had the dilating powers of an anaconda, but to help out his maintenance, he was, according to country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of farmers whose children he instructed. With these he lived successively a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood with all his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of a rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage, of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parson. His appearance, therefore, is apt to occasion some little stir at tea-table of a farmhouse, and the addition of a supernumerary dish of cakes or sweetmeats, or peradventure the parade of a silver teapot. Our man of letters, therefore, was peculiarly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. From his half-itinerant life, also, he was a kind of traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he was most firmly and potently believed. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. It was often his delight, after school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself upon a rich bed of clover bordering a little brook that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's direful tales. Then, as he wended his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature, at that witching hour, fluttered his excited imagination. The moan of a whippoorwill from the hillside, the boding cry of a tree-toad, the dreary hooting of a screech owl, or the sudden rustling in the thicket of birds frightened from their roost. The fireflies, too, which sparkled most vividly in the darkest places, now and then startled him, as one of uncommon brightness would stream across his path. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter's evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and sputtering along the hearth, and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields, and haunted brooks, and haunted bridges, and haunted houses, and particularly of the haunted horseman, or the headless horseman, and galloping Hessian of the hollow, as they sometimes called him. But if there was a pleasure in all this while snugly cuddling in the corner chimney of a chamber that was all of a ruddy glow from the crackling wood fire, and where, of course, no spectre dared to show its face, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night! How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder lest he should behold some uncouth being tramping close behind him. And how often was he thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast howling among the trees, in the idea that it was the galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings. All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness. Daylight put an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, or the whole race of witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the country damsels was Katrina von Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed not merely for her beauty but her vast expectations. She was withal a little of a coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions as most suited to set off her charms. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the sex, and it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Baltus von Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it. And he piqued himself upon the hearty abundance rather than the style in which he lived. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson. Hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn that might have served for a church, every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with treasures of the farm. The flail was busy resounding within it from morn till night. Rows of pigeons were enjoying the sunshine on the roof. Sleek, unwieldy porkers were grunting in the repose and abundance of their pens, from whence sallied forth now and then a troop of sucking pigs, as if to sniff the air. A stately squadron of snowy geese were riding in an adjoining pond, convoying whole fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling through the farmyard, and guinea fowl fretting about it, like ill-tempered housewives, with their peevish, discontented cry. Before the barn door strutted the gallant cock, that pattern of a husband, a warrior and fine gentleman, clapping his burnished wings and crowing in the pride and gladness of his heart, sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, and then generously calling his ever-hungry family of wives and children to enjoy the rich morsel which he had just discovered. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he thought upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in his belly and an apple in his mouth. And the pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie and tucked in with a coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, the ducks pairing cozily in dishes like snug married couples with a decent competency of onion sauce. The porkers he saw carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy relishing ham, not a turkey, but he beheld daintily trussed up, with its gizzard under its wing, and peradventure a necklace of savory sausages, and even bright Chanticleer himself lay sprawling on his back in a side dish, with uplifted claws as if craving that quarter which his chivalrous spirit disdained to ask for while living. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat, of rye, of buckwheat, and Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit which surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains, and his imagination expanded with the idea how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land and shingle palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already realized his hopes, and presented to him the blooming Katrina, with a whole family of children, mounted on the top of a wagon loaded with household trumpery, with pots and kettles dangling beneath, and he beheld himself bestride a pacing mare, with a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky or Tennessee or Lord knows where. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses with high-ridged but lowly sloping roofs, built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers. The low projecting eaves formed a piazza along the front. Under this were hung flails, harness, various utensils of husbandry, and nets for fishing in the neighboring river. A great spinning wheel at one end and a churn at the other showed the various uses to which this important porch might be devoted. From this piazza, the wondering Ichabod entered the hall, which formed the center of the mansion and the place of usual residence. Here rows of resplendent pewter ranged on a long dresser dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool ready to be spun. In another, a quantity of linsey woolsey just from the loom. Ears of Indian corn and strings of dried apples and peaches hung in gay festoons along the walls, mingled with the gaud of red peppers. And the door, left ajar, gave him a peep into the best parlor, where the claw-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors. Andirons with their accompanying shovel and tongs glistened from their covert of asparagus tops. Mock oranges and conch shells decorated the mantelpiece. Strings of various colored birds' eggs were suspended above it. A great ostrich egg was hung from the center of the room, and a corner cupboard, knowingly left open, displayed immense treasures of old silver and well-mended china. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon these regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this enterprise, however, he had more real difficulties than generally fell to the lot of knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such like easily conquered adversaries to contend with. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette, as well as the numerous rustic admirers who beset every portal to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out in common cause against any new competitor. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade of the name of Abraham, or according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brom van Brunt, the hero of the country round, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood. He was a broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short curly black hair, and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being as dexterous on horseback as a Tartar. He was also ready for either a fight or a frolic, but had more mischief than ill will in his composition, and, with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of waggish good humor at bottom. He had 3 or 4 boon companions who regarded him as their model. The neighbors looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill, and when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, they always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This rantipole hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries. And though his amorous toyings were sometimes like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, yet it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire, who felt no inclination to cross a lion in his amours, inasmuch as when his horse was seen tied to Von Tassel's paling on Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was courting, or as it was termed, sparking within. All other suitors passed by in despair and carried the war into other quarters. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend, and considering all things, a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness. Ichabod therefore made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. He made frequent visits to the farmhouse. He had nothing to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block to the path of lovers. Bald Von Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter better even than his pipe, and like a reasonable man and an excellent father, he let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had enough to do attending to her housekeeping and managing her poultry, for, as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me they have always been a matter of riddle and admiration, and he who holds undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. Certain it is, this was not the case with the redoubtable Brom Bones, and from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interests of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the palings on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually rose between him and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would fain to carry matters to open warfare, and have settled their pretensions to the lady according to the mode of those most concise and simple reasoners, the knights errant of yore, by single combat. But Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter the lists against him. He had overheard a boast of Bones that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf of his own schoolhouse. He was too wary to give him an opportunity. This left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic waggery in his disposition, and to play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They harried his hitherto peaceful domains, broke into the schoolhouse at night, and turned everything topsy-turvy, so that the poor schoolmaster began to think all the witches in the country held their meetings there. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all opportunities of turning him into ridicule in the presence of his mistress. In this way, matters went on for some time without producing any material effect on the relative situations of the contending powers. One fine autumn day, Ichabod received an invitation to attend a merrymaking or quilting frolic to be held that evening at Mynheer Von Tassel's. That he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier, he borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciled, I'll just say it like that, a choleric old Dutchman of the name of Hans von Ripper, and, thus gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight-errant in quest of adventures. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plough-horse that had outlived almost everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged. One eye had lost its pupil, and was glaring and spectral, and the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of gunpowder. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of his saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand like a scepter, and his horse jogged on. The motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested on the top of his nose, for so his scanty strip of forehead might be called, and the skirts of his black coat fluttered out almost to the horse's tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gate of Hans von Ripper. It was altogether such an apparition as is seldom to be met with in broad daylight. It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich golden livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye, ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of the jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast stores of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence on the trees, some gathered into baskets and barrels for the market, and others heaped up in rich piles for the cider press. Farther on he beheld great fields of Indian corn, with its golden ears peeping out from their leafy coverts, and holding out the promises of cakes and hasty pudding, and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath them turned up their fair round bellies to the sun, and giving ample prospects of the most luxurious pies. And anon he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields, breathing the odor of the beehive, and as he beheld them, soft anticipation stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, well buttered and garnished with honey or treacle by the delicate dimpled hand of Katrina von Tassel. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Herr von Tassel, which he found thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent country. Old farmers, a spare leathern-faced race, in homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings, huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles. Their brisk, withered little dames, in close-crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, homespun petticoats with scissors and pincushions, and gay calico pockets hanging on the outside. Buxom lasses, almost as antiquated as their mothers, excepting where a straw hat, a fine ribbon, or perhaps a white frock gave symptoms of city innovation. The sons in short square-skirted coats, with rows of stupendous brass buttons, and their hair generally queued in the fashion of the times. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mettle and mischief, and which no one but himself could manage. Fain would I pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Von Tassel's mansion. The abundant charms of a genuine Dutch country tea table in the sumptuous time of autumn. Such heaped up platters of cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doty donut, the tenderer oliekoek, and the crisp and crumbling cruller. Sweet cakes and short cakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes. And then there were apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, and moreover delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roasted chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled higgledy-piggledy pretty much as I have enumerated them, with the motherly teapot sending up its clouds of vapor from the midst. Heaven bless the mark! I want to breathe and the time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, and I am too eager to get on with my story. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in so great a hurry as his historian, but did ample justice to every dainty. He was a kind and thankful creature, whose heart dilated in proportion as his skin was filled with good cheer, and whose spirits rose with eating as some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes round him as he ate, chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all this scene of almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Old Baltus van Tassel moved among his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor, round and jolly as a harvest moon. His hospitable attentions were brief but expressive, being confined to a shake of a hand, a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to fall to and help themselves. And now the sound of the music from the common room or hall summoned to the dance. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle. To have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion and clattering about the room, you would have thought St. Vitus himself, that blessed patron of dance, was figuring before you in person. The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously in reply to all his amorous oglings, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the sager folks, who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. This neighborhood, at the time of which I am speaking, was one of those highly favored places which abound with chronicle and great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little becoming fiction, and, in the indistinctness of his recollection, to make himself the hero of every exploit. The immediate cause, however, was the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts. It was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's, and, as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken, and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was made also of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. The chief part of the stories, however, turned upon the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the headless horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and it was said tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of this church seemed always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which its decent whitewashed walls shone modestly forth like Christian purity, beaming through the shades of retirement. To look upon its grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seemed to sleep so quietly, one would think that there, at least, the dead might rest in peace. Over the deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was formerly thrown a wooden bridge. The bridge that led to it, and the bridge itself, the road that led to it, and the bridge itself, were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it, even in daytime, but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. Such was one of the favorite haunts of the headless horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. The tale was told of old Brower, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, and how he met with the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow, and was obliged to get up behind him, how they galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp, until they reached the bridge, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower into the brook, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder. This story was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey. He affirmed that on returning one night from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by this midnight trooper, that he had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch, and should have won it too, for the daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales, told in that drowsy overtone with which men talk in the dark, the countenances of the listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep into the mind of Ichabod. The revel now gradually broke up. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with his heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. What passed at this interview, I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth after no very great interval with an air of quiet desolation and chopfallen. Oh, these women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who'd been sacking a hen roost rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the left or to the right to notice the scene of rural wealth on which he had so often gloated, he went straight to the stable, and with several hearty cuffs and kicks roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountains of corn and oats and of whole valleys of timothy and clover. It was a very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homewards. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper into the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He'd never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees in the neighborhood, and formed a kind of a landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered, but it was a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and he ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly, he perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning and the white wood laid bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees smote against the saddle, but it was the rubbing of one huge bough upon another as they swayed about in the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy, thickly wooded glen. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution and gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge, but instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against a fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins to the other side and kicked lustily with the contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, to be true, but it was only to plunge to the other side of the road into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starveling ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge, with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, On the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The air of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late. And besides, what chance was there escaping a ghost or a goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in staggering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice. Still there was no answer. Once more he cudgeled the sides of his inflexible gunpowder, and shutting his eyes, broke forth with an involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself into motion, and with a scramble and a bound stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of this unknown might, now in some degree, might be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and his waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, bethought himself of the adventure of Brom Bones with the galloping Hessian, and now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind, and the other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavored to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody, dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip, but the spectre started full jump with him. Away then they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying, sparks flashing at every bound, Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttering in the air as he stretched his long, lank body over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road, which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, instead of keeping up it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through the sandy hollow, shaded by trees, for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge famous in goblin story, and just beyond the swells, the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet the panic of the steed had given his unskilful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the girths of his saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel, endeavoring to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder round the neck when the saddle fell to earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment, the terror of Hans von Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle, but there was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, an unskilful rider that he was. He had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on the other, sometimes jolting on the high ridge of his horse's backbone with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered him with hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brom Bones' ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can just reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind him to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups and in the very act of hurtling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. Boy, this paper. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by in a whirlwind. The next morning the old horse was found without his saddle, and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. The dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans von Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle, and an inquiry was set on foot. After diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt. The tracks of the horse's hooves deeply dented the road, and evidently at a furious speed were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close behind it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans von Ripper was the executor of his estate. He examined the bundle, which contained all his worldly effects. They consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 stocks for the neck, a pair or 2 of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, a rusty razor, a book of psalm tunes full of dog ears, a broken pitch pipe. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, excepting Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft and a New England Almanac, a book of dreams and fortune-telling, and in which last was a sheet of foolscap, much scribbled and blotted in several fruitless attempts to make a copy of verses in the honor of the heiress of Von Tassel. These magic books and the prophetic scroll were forthwith consigned to the flames by Hans von Ripper, who, from that time forward, determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good to come of this same reading and writing. Whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, and he had received his quarter's pay but a day or 2 before, he must have had about his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and the pumpkin were found. The stories of Brower and Bones and a whole budget of others were called to mind, and when they had diligently considered them all, compared them with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled his head about him any more. The school was removed to a different quarter of the hollow, and another pedagogue reigned in his stead. It is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after, and from whom this account of the ghastly adventure was received, brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, and that he had left the neighborhood partly through fear of the goblin and Hans von Ripper, and partly in mortification of having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, that he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school and studied law at the same time, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made Justice of the 10-Pound Court. Brom Bones, too, who, shortly after his rival's disappearance, conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story, often told by the neighborhood round the winter's evening fire. That is the story of Sleepy Hollow and Ichabod Crane. The descriptions, the writing, the characters. I love this story, and it gives us an amazing picture into the early 19th century and the late 18th century. What do you think, Aaron?
Excellent job.
Thank you.
Yeah, everyone give John a round of applause in the chat, and yeah, that was awesome. The pumpkin went out right as Ichabod started leaving the party.
Scary in and of itself.
Yep.
It's been a great Wednesday and a wonderful time to sit by the fire and relax and read this tale that is so descriptive of the times.
I was going to say,
yes,
all of the super chats are just donations. There's no questions.
Okay.
Do you want to just list them real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Let's read these real quick, and then we will get out of here. And thanks everyone for watching. Thanks everyone for donating. So Lisa B, thank you. Center for Food Preservation Arts is a new member. Thank you. Elizabeth Pusho is a new member. Thank you. Lisa Kilmer, love your channel. One of the absolute best crafted channels. Thank you. Kevin Boyette, love your channel. Thank you. Mechs are cool. Thank you. Hooray. Happy Halloween and happy harvest to everyone.
Woo!
Elena Boys is a new member. Thank you. Sherry, thank you. Says happy Halloween. Kevin Boyette, listen to your preschool teacher, kids. LOL. Anastas Anastasia is a new member. Thank you. Michael X, thank you. Fluffy Monkey, thank you. Ines Santos, thank you. Airgun Adventures is a new member. Thank you. Keltoid 5, thank you. Rustic Waggery and Tainted Brain. Mark 723 is a new member. Thank you. Chris Wilson, thank you. Denise Manoli Piran, thank you. Sue O'Connor, Save John from the Scary Pumpkin. Yep. Mark 723, thank you. Drag Dwee is a new member. Mark Willoughby, thank you. He sends a piece of fruit, giving you some coffee.
Thank you.
Keltoid 5, thank you. That's all I got.
Thank you, everyone. I'm almost done with my ginger cake here. Thank you, everyone, for your amazing support. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you on the next Nutmeg Tavern. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great day.